The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Blue Harbor, one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the soft murmur of conversation mixed with the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china. In the corner of the dining room stood a magnificent grand piano, its polished surface gleaming under the soft lighting. Eliza Martinez hurried between tables, her black uniform pressed despite the long day she'd already put in. At 32, her face showed the beginnings of fatigue lines, but her eyes remained bright and determined. She balanced 3 plates along her arm with the skill that comes only from years of practice. "Your salmon with lemon butter sauce," she said with a warm smile as she set a plate in front of an elderly woman. "And the filet mignon for you, sir. Medium rare, just as you requested." "Thank you, dear," the woman said, barely glancing up. Eliza nodded and moved to her next table, checking her watch quickly. It was almost 7. Miguel would be getting hungry. She glanced toward the staff break room where her 8-year-old son was supposed to be working on his homework. Her babysitter had called in sick at the last minute, and her neighbor who usually helped out was visiting family out of state. With no other options, she'd brought Miguel to work, promising her boss it wouldn't happen again. She hadn't seen her son in the break room when she'd gone to check 5 minutes ago, and a knot of worry tightened in her stomach. As she delivered drinks to another table, she scanned the restaurant, finally spotting him sitting quietly in a chair near the kitchen, watching the comings and goings with wide, curious eyes. Relief washed over her. At a corner table sat a man dining alone. He wore a simple gray sweater that probably cost more than Eliza made in a month. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and he had the relaxed confidence of someone who never worried about money. He was looking at his phone, occasionally taking a bite of his steak without really seeming to taste it. James Harrington, tech genius and founder of Global Connect, had chosen Blue Harbor for dinner simply because it was close to his downtown office, and he was too tired to think of anywhere else. After 16 hours of meetings about his company's latest acquisition, he wanted quiet and a decent meal before heading home to his empty penthouse. He glanced up from his email when the waitress refilled his water glass. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Eliza asked. "No, this is fine, thank you," James replied, noticing for the first time how tired the woman looked. Despite this, her smile seemed genuine. He returned to his phone as she walked away. In a quiet moment between courses, Miguel slipped from his chair and wandered across the dining room. The restaurant wasn't quite full yet, and the boy moved carefully between tables, avoiding the busy servers. His eyes were fixed on the grand piano that had fascinated him since they'd arrived. For months now, Miguel had been obsessed with music. He'd watch piano tutorials on the old tablet Eliza had bought secondhand, trying to practice the finger movements on their kitchen table. They couldn't afford a real piano or even lessons, but Miguel persisted, using a paper keyboard he'd drawn himself to practice. He stood beside the piano now, his small hand hovering just above the keys, not quite daring to touch them. The instrument seemed magical to him, full of possibilities. James looked up from his phone just as Eliza noticed her son had wandered off. He watched as panic briefly crossed her face before she spotted the boy by the piano. He observed with mild interest as she quickly finished taking an order and then made her way across the room. "Miguel," she whispered, kneeling beside him. "You can't be over here, honey. This is for the restaurant's evening performer." "But Mama, look at it," the boy whispered back, his eyes wide with wonder. "It's so beautiful." Eliza glanced around. The evening pianist wouldn't arrive for another hour, and her section was momentarily caught up. The restaurant manager was in the back dealing with a delivery issue. "Just for 1 minute," she said softly. "But you can't touch the keys, okay? We just look." Miguel nodded solemnly, but his eyes pleaded for more. Eliza bit her lip, then made a decision that would change everything. She quickly lifted her son, setting him gently on the bench. 10 seconds, she whispered. "Just feel what it's like to sit here." James found himself watching the scene with growing interest. He'd been about to return to his emails when he saw the waitress lift the small boy onto the piano bench. There was something in the reverent way the child looked at the instrument that stirred a distant memory. Miguel sat perfectly still, his hands now resting lightly on his lap, afraid to touch the keys but thrilled just to be so close to a real piano. His face was transformed with pure joy. "Time's up, little man," Eliza said, checking to make sure no one from management had noticed. Back to your homework. Please, Mama, Miguel whispered. Can I just touch one key? Just to hear what it sounds like? I promise I'll be super quiet. Eliza hesitated, knowing she should say no. If her boss saw this, she could lose her job. But the look in her son's eyes broke her resolve. One key, she said, very softly. With ceremonial slowness, Miguel raised his right index finger and gently pressed a middle C. The clear note hung in the air like a drop of pure light. The boy's face lit up as if he'd just discovered buried treasure. James watched, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. Something about the boy's expression, that mixture of awe and hunger, sent him tumbling back through the years to his own childhood. Before the tech empire, before the billions, there had been a second-hand keyboard his parents had scraped together money to buy him for his 10th birthday. Without thinking, Miguel's fingers found 2 more notes, playing a simple 3-note pattern he'd learned from one of his YouTube videos. The notes were hesitant but perfectly in sequence. Eliza's eyes widened in surprise. Where did you learn that? From the videos, Miguel whispered back. I practice on my paper piano. James leaned forward slightly, his meal forgotten. The boy had never touched a real piano before, yet he'd just played a simple but correct musical phrase. A small group of diners at nearby tables turned to look, some smiling at the sweet scene, others frowning at the unexpected interruption of their expensive meals. One of the other waiters caught Eliza's eye and gestured urgently toward the kitchen, where the restaurant manager had reappeared. We have to go now, Eliza whispered, quickly lifting Miguel from the bench. Thank you for being gentle, she added, smoothing his hair as she set him down. But Mama, I was just starting to. I know, sweetheart. Maybe someday. The sadness behind her smile was visible even from where James sat. Now back to your spot, okay? I've got to finish my shift. Miguel nodded reluctantly, casting one last longing look at the piano before walking back to his chair near the kitchen. Eliza straightened her uniform and hurried to check on her tables, apologizing quietly to a couple who had been watching the scene with disapproval. So sorry for the disturbance, she said. Can I get you another bottle of sparkling water? James watched as she moved efficiently between tables, her face composed into a professional mask once more. But he'd seen the momentary crack in that mask, the pain of a parent who couldn't give their child something they desperately wanted. It was a look his own mother had worn many times during his childhood. He signaled for the check, his mind no longer on his emails or the meetings that had filled his day. As he waited, he watched the boy sitting quietly with a worn notebook open in front of him. Instead of writing, though, the child was moving his fingers across the table in silent patterns, practicing piano on an imaginary keyboard. Something stirred in James, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Before he built his tech empire, before the acquisition meetings and shareholder calls, he'd started his company with a mission: to create technology that could open doors for people who had none. Somewhere along the way, that purpose had gotten buried under profit margins and market expansion. When Eliza returned with his check, James signed it quickly, adding a tip larger than the meal itself. But as he watched the boy continuing his silent practice, he knew that money wasn't the answer here. At least not just money. The restaurant's actual pianist arrived, setting up his sheet music on the grand piano. The first notes of a classical piece floated through the restaurant as James stood to leave. He paused, watching Miguel's head lift at the sound. The boy's eyes fixed on the pianist's hands with absolute concentration. James sat back down, canceled his next meeting with a quick text, and ordered a coffee. He had an idea forming, one that would surprise everyone in the restaurant, including himself. But first he needed to watch a bit longer, to be sure of what he'd seen in the boy's eyes and in his mother's sacrifice. Sometimes the most important business decisions happened outside of boardrooms. And tonight, something told James that what happened next would matter more than any deal he'd ever made. The restaurant's pianist continued playing, his fingers dancing over the keys with practiced ease. James sipped his coffee slowly, watching Miguel's reaction to the music. The boy was completely absorbed, his homework forgotten as he studied every movement of the pianist's hands. From his corner table, James could see both mother and son clearly. Eliza moved efficiently between tables, but her eyes frequently darted to Miguel, making sure he stayed put. The restaurant was filling up now, the dinner rush in full swing. She barely had a moment to breathe. During a brief lull, Eliza stopped by Miguel's chair. You doing okay, buddy? She asked, quickly straightening his collar. Yes, Mama, he replied, his eyes still fixed on the pianist. But look how he uses his little finger on those black keys. That's different from what I've been practicing. Eliza smiled, surprised by his observation. You're really paying attention, aren't you? I'm trying to remember everything so I can practice later, Miguel said. The comment made Eliza's heart ache. Practice on what? Their kitchen table? The paper keyboard he'd drawn? She touched his cheek gently. I need to get back to work. Just a couple more hours, okay? As she turned away, James noticed the flash of determination on her face. He recognized that look, the same one he'd seen in his own mother's eyes years ago when she'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. It was the look of someone who refused to be defined by their circumstances. The restaurant manager, a thin man with a perpetual frown, appeared by the kitchen doors. He spotted Miguel and his frown deepened. He beckoned to Eliza, who quickly made her way over to him. Though James couldn't hear their conversation, he could read the body language clearly enough. The manager gestured toward Miguel, his movements sharp with disapproval. Eliza nodded repeatedly, her shoulders tense but her posture respectful. She was clearly apologizing, explaining, promising it wouldn't happen again. James felt a flare of irritation watching the scene. The boy was sitting quietly, bothering no one. Yet the manager acted as if his mere presence was offensive to the restaurant's upscale atmosphere. When Eliza returned to her section, her smile seemed more forced. She stopped briefly by Miguel's chair, whispering something that made him nod solemnly. The boy opened his notebook again, but his eyes kept drifting back to the piano. The restaurant's pianist took a break, leaving the grand piano temporarily unattended. James watched as Miguel's gaze followed the musician out of the room, then returned longingly to the now silent instrument. The boy's fingers twitched slightly on his notebook as if playing invisible keys. James had seen enough. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Jerry, he said when his assistant answered, I need you to find me information on a piano instructor. The best in the city. He paused, listening. Yes, tonight. And I'll need other arrangements made. I'll text you the details in a few minutes. James ended the call and signaled for Eliza to come to his table. Can I get you something else, sir? She asked, her professional smile back in place. Your son, James said quietly. He seems very interested in the piano. Eliza's smile faltered slightly. Yes, he is. I'm sorry if he disturbed you earlier. It won't happen again. He didn't disturb me at all, James assured her. In fact, I was impressed. Has he had lessons? A flush crept into Eliza's cheeks. No, that's not really possible right now. But he watches tutorials online. He's very determined. I could see that, James said. And those 3 notes he played, they were perfect. Eliza's expression softened with pride. He practices on a paper keyboard he drew. Sometimes I find him asleep with his fingers still moving over it. James nodded, understanding completely. He'd been that child once, hungry for music, for knowledge, for a chance. How long have you worked here? He asked. Almost 4 years, Eliza replied, glancing around to make sure none of her other tables needed her. And I have another job in the mornings at a coffee shop. And you're raising your son alone? Something guarded flashed in her eyes. Yes, it's just the 2 of us. I apologize for the personal questions, James said. I have a proposition for you, but first I'd like to speak with your son if that's allowed. Eliza hesitated, looking torn between curiosity and caution. I don't think my manager would... I'll handle your manager, James said with quiet confidence. Would you be comfortable with me speaking to your son about music? Just for a moment, here in the restaurant where you can see us. Eliza studied him for a long moment. May I ask why you're interested? James considered how much to say. I was very much like him at that age. Music was my first love before I got into technology, and I recognize raw talent when I see it. She seemed to come to a decision. Let me check with my manager. James watched as she approached the thin man again. This time, when the manager looked over at James, his expression changed from annoyance to surprise, and then to a fawning smile. James knew that look well. It was the face people made when they realized who he was and how much money he had. A moment later, Eliza returned with Miguel beside her. The boy looked nervous but curious. Miguel, this gentleman would like to talk to you about music, Eliza said, her hand protectively on her son's shoulder. Hello. Miguel, James said, extending his hand. My name is James, The boy shook his hand solemnly. Nice to meet you, sir. I saw you at the piano earlier, James said. Do you play? Miguel glanced at his mother before answering. Not really. We don't have a piano, but I practice a lot and watch videos. Those 3 notes you played, how did you know which ones to press? Miguel's face lit up at the question. The middle one is C. That's the first note most people learn. And then I played E and G, which makes a C major chord. I can show you on my paper piano if you want. James smiled, impressed by the boy's knowledge. You taught yourself music theory? Just a little bit, Miguel said with endearing modesty. I want to learn more, but some of the videos use big words I don't understand yet. James pulled out his phone and opened a music theory app. Do you know what this is? He asked, showing Miguel a simple chord progression. The boy studied the screen intently. That's C major, then G major, then A minor, then F major. It's a really common pattern. Lots of songs use it. James raised his eyebrows, genuinely surprised. He looked up at Eliza, who seemed equally amazed. He learned so quickly, she said softly. Sometimes I can't keep up. James nodded, then turned back to Miguel. Would you like to try playing something on the piano? Just for a minute or two, with permission this time. Miguel's eyes widened. Really, can I, Mama? Eliza glanced nervously toward her manager, who was now hovering nearby, clearly monitoring the situation. I don't think... I've already spoken with the management, James interrupted smoothly. It's been arranged. The manager stepped forward with an obsequious smile. Of course, Mr. Harrington. We'd be delighted to accommodate your request. The regular pianist is on break for another 10 minutes. Eliza looked confused by this special treatment but didn't question it. All right, but just for a minute, Miguel. And remember to be gentle with the keys. James stood and led them to the grand piano. A few diners looked up curiously as Miguel climbed onto the bench, this time with full permission. The boy sat for a moment, his hands hovering over the keys in reverence. Go ahead, James encouraged. Play whatever you like. Miguel took a deep breath and placed his small hands on the keys. He began to play a simple melody, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but with surprising confidence. His timing was slightly off, but the notes were correct. For someone who had never had formal lessons and had barely touched a real piano before, it was remarkable. When he finished, James asked, Can you play anything else? Miguel nodded and began another tune, this one more complex. James recognized it as the beginning of Beethoven's Für Elise, a piece many beginners learned. The boy played just the opening phrase, making a few mistakes but continuing bravely. Several diners had stopped eating to watch, their expressions ranging from annoyance to amusement to genuine interest. One elderly couple at a nearby table smiled warmly. That's impressive for someone who's never had lessons, James said when Miguel finished. How did you learn that? I watched it a lot of times on videos, Miguel explained. And I counted the spaces between the notes. James turned to Eliza, who was watching her son with a mixture of pride and sadness. He has a natural gift, he said quietly. Perfect pitch too, I think. And a good ear for patterns, Eliza nodded. I've always thought so. I just wish... She trailed off, but the unspoken words hung in the air. I wish I could give him what he needs. The restaurant pianist returned, pausing when he saw Miguel at his instrument. James approached him and spoke briefly, slipping something into the man's hand that made his eyes widen. The pianist nodded and stepped back, apparently willing to extend his break. James returned to the piano and sat beside Miguel on the bench. Would you like me to show you something? He asked. Miguel nodded eagerly. Yes, please. James placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Unlike Miguel's hesitant attempts, his fingers moved with practiced confidence. The piece was complex but beautiful, filling the restaurant with cascading notes. Conversations hushed as diners turned to watch. Even the servers paused in their duties, trays balanced carefully as they listened. Eliza stood transfixed, her eyes moving from her son's awestruck face to James's confident hands. As the piece reached its climax, James slowed down and looked at Miguel. Would you like to try playing with me? I'll show you a simple part you can add. The boy nodded, his expression serious with concentration. James showed him a pattern of 3 notes to play repeatedly, forming a bass line to accompany the melody. After a few attempts, Miguel got it right. Ready? James asked. We'll start together on 3. He counted softly and they began to play. The Billionaire and the Waitress's Son, creating music together on the grand piano of an upscale restaurant, while a room full of strangers watched in growing amazement. No one in the restaurant, not even Eliza, could have guessed what James was planning to do next. The duet between James and Miguel continued, growing more confident as the boy settled into the simple pattern James had taught him. A few diners pulled out their phones to record the unexpected performance, their faces showing delight at the unusual scene unfolding before them. Eliza watched with her hand pressed against her mouth, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She'd never seen her son this happy. The joy on his face was pure and perfect. It was everything she'd ever wanted to give him but couldn't. The restaurant manager stood nearby, his earlier disapproval replaced by confusion and a growing awareness that something significant was happening. Several customers were smiling at him as if to say, "Aren't you lucky to have this happening in your restaurant?" As their impromptu performance came to an end, the restaurant erupted in applause. Miguel looked up, startled by the reaction, then broke into a wide grin. James nodded encouragingly at the boy before turning to face their audience. "Thank you," he said simply, his hand resting lightly on Miguel's shoulder. An elderly woman at a nearby table called out, "The boy has a gift. Is he your student?" James shook his head. "No, we just met tonight." This young man taught himself to play without ever having regular access to a piano. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the restaurant. Miguel looked down shyly, but there was pride in his posture now. James glanced at Eliza, still standing frozen near the kitchen doors. This young man's mother works here, supporting them both by herself. All eyes turned to Eliza, who blushed deeply. One of her regular customers, a middle-aged woman who always ordered the salmon, broke into a smile of recognition. "That's Eliza. She's been serving us for years." The restaurant manager stepped forward, clearly uncertain how to handle the situation, but sensing an opportunity for good publicity. "Yes, Eliza is one of our most valued team members," he said smoothly, as if he hadn't been scolding her earlier. James stood up from the piano bench and helped Miguel down. "I think you have a bright future in music," he told the boy. "With the right training." Miguel's face lit up. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," James replied. "I recognize talent when I see it." He guided Miguel back to Eliza, who immediately wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders. "That was beautiful, Miguel," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." James looked at them both for a long moment, making a decision. Then he turned to address the entire restaurant. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room, "I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but I've just witnessed something extraordinary. This young man has a rare gift for music, a gift that deserves to be nurtured." The dining room fell completely silent. Even the kitchen staff had paused to listen, peering through the service doors. "My name is James Harrington," he continued. A few gasps of recognition came from diners who suddenly placed where they'd seen his face before, on magazine covers and tech websites. "And music was my first love, long before I founded Global Connect." Eliza's eyes widened as she finally realized who he was. The billionaire tech founder whose face occasionally appeared on the business news she glimpsed on the break room TV. What was he doing here, playing piano with her son? "When I was about Miguel's age," James went on, "I was fortunate enough to have someone who recognized my potential and made sure I had access to music lessons, even though my family couldn't afford them. That simple act of generosity changed the course of my life." He smiled at Miguel. "Tonight I've seen that same potential in this young man, and I believe we all have a responsibility to help the next generation discover their gifts." James reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Eliza. "I'd like to provide Miguel with piano lessons from the best teachers in the city, and a proper piano for your home." Eliza stared at the card in her hand, unable to process what she was hearing. I don't understand," she stammered. "Why would you do this for us?" "You don't even know us because someone did it for me," James replied simply, "and because your son has something special that shouldn't go to waste." The restaurant was so quiet you could hear the ice shifting in water glasses. Everyone was watching the scene unfold with rapt attention. "I can't accept this," Eliza said in a low voice, though her hand clutched the card tightly. "It's too much." "It's not charity," James assured her. "It's an investment in talent. And if you're uncomfortable, consider it a loan. Miguel can pay it forward someday when he's successful." Miguel looked up at his mother with pleading eyes. "Please, Mama. I promise I'll practice every day." Eliza looked from her son to James and back again. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked, "Are you serious about this? You would really do this for him?" "Absolutely," James replied. "My assistant will call you tomorrow to make arrangements." The restaurant manager stepped forward, his face a mask of forced joviality. "What a wonderful gesture, Mr. Harrington. Blue Harbor is honored to have played a small part in this touching story." James gave him a cool look. "Yes, especially considering you were about to scold Eliza earlier for letting her son near the piano." The manager's smile faltered. Well, we have certain standards." "Perhaps those standards should include recognizing talent and supporting your staff," James suggested mildly. Several diners nodded in agreement, making the manager flush with embarrassment. An older gentleman at a nearby table stood up, wineglass in hand. "I'd like to propose a toast," he announced, "to the young pianist and to Mr. Harrington's generosity." People throughout the restaurant raised their glasses. "Hear, hear," several voices called out, but James wasn't finished. He turned back to address the room again. "This experience has reminded me of something important," he said. "There are talented children everywhere who never get the chance to develop their gifts because of financial barriers." He paused, looking thoughtful. "Tonight, I'm not just making a commitment to Miguel. I'm announcing the creation of a new foundation, Keys of Opportunity, which will provide musical education to children from low-income families across this city." A burst of applause filled the restaurant. Several diners were dabbing at their eyes with napkins. "I'm pledging $5 million to start," James continued, "and I challenge my fellow business leaders to match that amount. Together, we can ensure that no child with Miguel's level of talent goes without proper training." The applause grew louder. A woman called out, "I'll donate too. My company will help." Miguel tugged at Eliza's sleeve. "Mama, what's happening?" he whispered, overwhelmed by the attention. Eliza knelt down to his level, her eyes shining with tears. "Something wonderful, sweetheart. Something very wonderful." James knelt down too, so he was eye to eye with Miguel. "Would you like to be the first student in our new program?" he asked quietly. Miguel nodded, his face solemn. "Yes, sir, but—" He hesitated, then continued in a rush. "Will other kids get to learn too? Like my friend Zach from school? He loves drums, but his mom can't afford lessons either." James smiled, touched by the boy's concern for others even in his moment of good fortune. "Absolutely. The foundation will help many children. In fact, we'll need your help to find others who love music as much as you do." The boy's face broke into a wide smile. "I can do that. There are lots of kids at my school who want to play instruments." A server approached with a bottle of champagne and several glasses on a tray. "Compliments of the chef," she said, setting it down on a nearby table. "He says it's a night worth celebrating." As the champagne was poured and passed around to the adults, the restaurant's atmosphere had transformed. What had begun as an ordinary Tuesday evening had become something special, a moment when strangers were united by music, generosity, and the pure joy on a child's face. Eliza accepted a glass with shaking hands. "I don't know what to say," she told James. "Thank you seems so inadequate." "Don't thank me yet," James replied with a smile. "Wait until you've heard Miguel practicing the same piece for the 100th time." She laughed, a genuine sound of happiness that made several nearby diners smile in response. "I would love nothing more than to hear that." The restaurant pianist who had been watching from the sidelines approached them. "If I may," he said, "I'd be honored to give Miguel his first official lesson. Perhaps tomorrow after my evening set." James looked at Eliza, deferring to her. "What do you think?" "That would be wonderful," she said. Then with a worried look, "But I work tomorrow evening too." "I believe you're due for some time off," James said. "I've already spoken with your manager about adjusting your schedule." The thin manager nodded quickly from across the room, clearly eager to please now. "Of course. Take the week off, Eliza, with pay." Miguel was bouncing with excitement. "Can we start tonight? Just a little lesson?" The pianist laughed. "Eager, aren't you? That's good. The best musicians always are." He gestured toward the piano. "Come on then. 5 minutes before I have to play for the dinner crowd again." As Miguel happily followed the pianist back to the grand piano, James turned to Eliza. "I meant what I said. This isn't charity, it's opportunity. The same kind someone gave me when I was his age." Eliza looked at him with clear eyes. "Who was it?" "The person who helped you?" James smiled. a distant memory softening his face. My elementary school music teacher, Mrs. Chen, she convinced a local college to give me free lessons and found a donated keyboard for me to practice on. She changed everything for me. And now you're changing everything for us, Eliza said softly. From the piano came the sound of Miguel playing his simple part of their duet. With the professional pianist now guiding his hands into the proper position, the boy's face was a study in concentration, drinking in every correction and suggestion. No one in the restaurant could have predicted what would happen next, or how far the ripples from this evening would spread. 6 months had passed since that life-changing night at Blue Harbor Restaurant. The crisp autumn air carried the sound of piano music through the open window of Eliza and Miguel's new apartment. It wasn't a luxury building, but it was clean, safe, and most importantly, it had enough space for the upright piano that now stood against the living room wall. Miguel sat at the instrument, his small fingers moving confidently across the keys as he worked through a Chopin piece that would have seemed impossible for him just months ago. Eliza watched from the kitchen as she prepared dinner, still sometimes hardly believing the turn their lives had taken. The apartment door opened, and James walked in, carrying a folder of papers and a small gift bag. After that first night, he had become a regular presence in their lives, overseeing Miguel's musical education with genuine personal interest rather than just financial support. "How's the practice going?" he asked, setting down his things and moving to stand behind Miguel. "Good. Mrs. Rivera says I'm making progress on the left-hand part," Miguel replied without stopping his playing. "Listen to this section." He repeated a complex passage, his face screwed up in concentration. When he finished, he looked up at James expectantly. "Much better than last week," James said with an approving nod. "You're keeping the rhythm steady now, even when the notes get tricky." Eliza wiped her hands on a dish towel and came to join them. "He's been practicing that part for hours. I almost had to drag him away for dinner last night." "That's how you know he's a real musician," James said with a laugh. "Food becomes optional when you're in the middle of mastering a piece." Miguel beamed at being called a real musician. He closed his piano book and hopped off the bench. "What's in the bag?" he asked, eyeing the gift James had brought. "Miguel," Eliza gently scolded, "don't be nosy." "It's all right," James said. "It is for him after all." He handed the gift bag to Miguel. "A little something to celebrate your 6 months of lessons." Miguel eagerly pulled out the tissue paper and found a beautiful metronome made of polished wood with brass fittings. His eyes widened. "My very own metronome. Thank you." He immediately put it on top of the piano and started experimenting with the settings. "And how are things at the foundation office?" Eliza asked James, gesturing for him to sit at their small dining table while she returned to the kitchen. "Better than I expected," James replied, loosening his tie. "We've enrolled 43 children so far, and we have 15 music teachers working with us. The waiting list is growing every day." "Any word on the community center space?" Eliza asked as she stirred a pot of stew. "That's partly why I came by," James said, patting the folder he'd brought. "The deal closed today. We officially own the old library building on Pine Street. Renovations start next week to turn it into our music education center." "That's wonderful news," Eliza exclaimed. She had left her waitressing job 3 months ago to become the foundation's community outreach coordinator, a position she'd initially resisted until James convinced her that her personal experience made her perfect for the role. "And," James continued, pulling papers from the folder, "the board unanimously approved your proposal for the instrument donation program. We're going to start collecting used instruments next month." Eliza's face lit up with pride. The program had been her idea, asking people to donate instruments they no longer used, which would then be repaired if needed and given to children who couldn't afford them. "I already have 5 families ready to donate. My old customer from Blue Harbor, the one who always ordered salmon. She has 2 violins her children no longer play." Miguel looked up from his metronome. "Can I help fix the instruments? I'm good at fixing things." "I think that's a great idea," James said. "We're hiring a professional repair person, but I'm sure they could use an assistant." The buzzer for the apartment rang. Eliza checked her watch. That must be Mrs. Rivera for Miguel's lesson. Miguel jumped up. "I'll let her in." He raced to the intercom, excited despite having already practiced for 2 hours that day. As the boy pressed the button to unlock the building's front door, James lowered his voice. "How's he doing, really?" Eliza glanced toward Miguel to make sure he was still occupied. Amazing. His teachers say they've never seen anyone progress so quickly at his age. But more than that, he's happy, confident. He makes friends easily now. Before he was always so shy. And you? James asked. How are you doing with all the changes? Eliza stirred the stew thoughtfully. Honestly, sometimes I wake up thinking it was all a dream, that I'll find myself back in our old apartment getting ready for my double shift. She smiled. But then I hear the piano and I remember it's real. There was a knock at the door and Miguel rushed to open it. Mrs. Rivera entered, a stern-looking woman with kind eyes that belied her serious demeanor. She carried a large tote bag filled with sheet music and music theory books. Good evening, everyone, she said, nodding to James and Eliza before turning her full attention to Miguel. Have you been practicing the Chopin as I asked? Yes, ma'am, Miguel said eagerly. I worked extra on the left-hand part like you said. Excellent. Let's hear it then. She moved toward the piano, all business. James stood up. I should leave you to your lesson. Eliza, can I speak with you in the hallway for a moment? They stepped outside the apartment, leaving Miguel and his teacher to their work. In the hallway, James's expression turned more serious. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, he said. I received a call from a producer at National Public Radio. They want to do a story about the foundation and Miguel. Eliza's eyes widened. A radio story? About us? James nodded. They heard about what happened at the restaurant. Apparently, one of the diners that night is a regular contributor to their programs. They're interested in telling the story of how the foundation started and following Miguel's progress. I don't know, Eliza said hesitantly. Miguel's just a child. All this attention. I understand your concerns, James assured her. That's why I wanted to talk to you first before mentioning it to him. We can set boundaries, make sure they respect his privacy, or we can decline altogether. Eliza leaned against the wall thinking, would it help the foundation? Help other kids get the same opportunity? Most likely, yes. More publicity means more donations, more awareness. But that doesn't mean you have to say yes. Miguel's well-being comes first. From inside the apartment came the sound of the Chopin piece, played more confidently than before. Mrs. Rivera's voice could be heard offering guidance on a particular passage. Let me think about it, Eliza said finally. I'll talk to Miguel too, see how he feels. James nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. He glanced at his watch. I should get going. Board meeting in an hour. You work too much, Eliza said with a small smile. Even with all your money, you work harder than anyone I know. James shrugged. Old habits. Besides, this doesn't feel like work. Not the way running Global Connect sometimes does. He hesitated, then added, Actually, I've been thinking about stepping back from my CEO role, focusing more on the foundation. Really? Eliza looked surprised. But your company is your life's work. It was, James agreed. But priorities change. The foundation. It feels more meaningful now. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to Miguel's playing. The boy hit a wrong note, stopped, then started the passage again, determined to get it right. He reminds me of myself at that age, James said softly. So hungry to learn, to prove himself. You've given him so much, Eliza said. More than just the piano and lessons. You've given him confidence, a future. James shook his head. He always had a future. I just helped clear the path a little. He looked directly at Eliza. And it goes both ways, you know. Meeting you two that night. It changed something for me too. Before Eliza could respond, the door opened and Miguel poked his head out. Mrs. Rivera wants to know if Mr. James can hear my new piece before he leaves. Please, James laughed. How can I refuse an invitation like that? He followed Miguel back into the apartment where Mrs. Rivera was sorting through sheet music. He's been working on a surprise, the music teacher explained with an uncharacteristic smile. He wanted to play it for you when it was ready. Miguel sat at the piano, suddenly looking nervous. He took a deep breath, positioned his hands, and began to play. The piece was simple but beautiful, a folk melody arranged for piano. He played it with feeling, his small face intense with concentration. James recognized the tune. It was from his hometown, a melody his mother used to hum while she worked. He'd mentioned it once, months ago, when telling Miguel about his own childhood. When Miguel finished, he looked up anxiously. Did you recognize it? I asked Mrs. Rivera to help me find it and learn it for you. I recognized it immediately, James said, his voice a little rough with emotion. My mother used to sing that to me. How did you remember? Miguel shrugged. You said it was important to you, so I remembered. Eliza watched the exchange with a warm smile. In the 6 months since that fateful night at Blue Harbor, she'd seen many sides of James Harrington, the businessman, the philanthropist, the former music prodigy. But this was the side she valued most, the man who genuinely cared, who saw her son not as a charity case but as a person with gifts to offer the world. We're playing in the Foundation's first student recital next month, Miguel announced proudly. Will you come? I wouldn't miss it for anything, James promised. In fact, I was thinking we might make it a bigger event than we originally planned. A proper concert with all 43 students. We could invite potential donors, community leaders, and the restaurant manager from Blue Harbor, Miguel suggested with a mischievous grin. So he can see I'm not just making noise on his piano anymore. They all laughed, even stern Mrs. Rivera. The piano teacher gathered her things, giving Miguel his assignments for the next lesson before leaving. As the door closed behind her, Eliza turned to James. Stay for dinner? It's just stew and bread, but there's plenty. I'd like that, James said, canceling his next meeting with a quick text message. Some things he had learned in the past 6 months were more important than business. Outside the window, the city continued its busy pace. But inside this small apartment, something special had taken root and was continuing to grow. Something that had begun with a simple act of kindness and a child's love for music. 3 years had passed since that fateful evening at Blue Harbor Restaurant. The grand concert hall was filled to capacity, its plush red seats occupied by an eclectic mix of people, wealthy donors in expensive suits, families from all walks of life, music teachers, and curious community members. A sense of anticipation hung in the air as the lights began to dim. Backstage, 11-year-old Miguel adjusted his bow tie nervously. He had performed in many recitals over the past 3 years, but tonight was different. Tonight was the 3rd anniversary celebration of the Keys of Opportunity Foundation, and he would be playing with a full orchestra for the first time. Eliza straightened his collar, her eyes shining with pride. You're going to be amazing, she whispered. Just like in rehearsal. What if I mess up? Miguel asked, his voice small. Then you'll keep going, just like Mrs. Rivera taught you, Eliza said firmly. But you won't mess up. You've worked too hard. From behind them came James's voice. She's right, you know. I've heard you practice this piece 100 times. You could play it in your sleep. Miguel turned to see James approaching, dressed in a tuxedo but looking as comfortable as if he were in jeans. Over the years, the billionaire had become much more than a benefactor to them. He was family now, a constant presence in their lives. The orchestra sounds so loud during rehearsal, Miguel confessed. What if I can't hear myself play? James knelt down so he was eye level with the boy. Focus on the music, not the noise. Remember when you used to practice on your paper piano? You didn't need to hear the notes then, you felt them. Miguel nodded, taking a deep breath. I'm ready. Good, James said, standing up. Because they're about to announce you. I need to go introduce you. He winked at the boy. Don't come out until you hear your name, okay? We want the full dramatic effect. As James walked toward the stage, Eliza pulled Miguel into a quick hug. I am so proud of you, she whispered. No matter what happens out there. On stage, James approached the microphone. The murmur of the audience died down as he began to speak. Good evening, and thank you all for coming to celebrate the 3rd anniversary of the Keys of Opportunity Foundation, he began. 3 years ago, something unexpected happened to me. I walked into a restaurant for a quiet dinner, and I walked out with a new purpose. The audience listened attentively as James recounted the story that many of them already knew. How he had witnessed a young boy's raw talent and a mother's sacrifice, and how that moment had inspired the creation of the foundation. Since that night, James continued, we have provided musical education to over 500 children across the city. We've distributed 327 instruments to students who couldn't afford them. We've hired 32 music teachers, many of whom come from the very communities we serve. Applause rippled through the audience. In the front row, the manager from Blue Harbor Restaurant nodded appreciatively. He had become one of the foundation's most enthusiastic supporters, hosting fundraising dinners at his establishment twice a year. But tonight, James said, I want to focus on just one student, the young man who started it all. When I first met him, he was teaching himself piano on a paper keyboard he had drawn. Today, he's the youngest person ever to receive the City Youth Music Achievement Award. More applause, louder this time. Eliza felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened from backstage. "Ladies and gentlemen," James announced, "please welcome to the stage, performing Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21 with the City Philharmonic Orchestra, Mr. Miguel Martinez." The audience erupted in applause as Miguel walked onto the stage, looking tiny next to the grand piano but carrying himself with quiet confidence. He bowed to the audience, then to the orchestra conductor, before taking his seat at the piano. For a moment he sat perfectly still, gathering himself. Then, with a nod to the conductor, the orchestra began to play the opening bars of the Mozart concerto. When it was time for Miguel's entrance, his hands moved to the keys with practiced precision. From her place in the wings, Eliza watched in wonder as her son played. Gone was the little boy who had gazed longingly at the restaurant piano. In his place was a young musician with genuine talent, honed by thousands of hours of practice and the best teaching money could buy. As the piece progressed, Miguel seemed to forget his nerves. His face relaxed into an expression of pure joy, the same look he'd had the first time he'd touched a real piano. The orchestra supported him beautifully, never overpowering his playing but enhancing it. In the audience, people leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the young performer. Even those who had come only for the free champagne at intermission found themselves moved by the music and the story behind it. When the piece reached its conclusion, there was a moment of breathless silence before the concert hall erupted in a standing ovation. Miguel stood and bowed, his face flushed with triumph and relief. He gestured to the orchestra and conductor, acknowledging their part in the performance, before looking toward the wings where his mother stood. Impulsively, he ran to the side of the stage and pulled Eliza out with him. The applause grew even louder as the audience recognized her from James's introduction. Miguel led his mother to center stage and they bowed together, her arm around his shoulders. James watched from the side, content to let them have this moment. This was what it had all been about. Not just discovering musical talent, but changing lives, opening doors that would otherwise have remained closed. After the concert, the reception area buzzed with conversation. Donors chatted with students and their families, teachers discussed upcoming programs, and a local TV crew interviewed James about the foundation's future plans. "The success has been beyond what we imagined," James told the reporter, "but we're just getting started. Next year, we'll be expanding to 2 neighboring cities, and we're introducing a college scholarship program for our graduating seniors." Nearby, Miguel was surrounded by a small crowd of admirers, graciously accepting their compliments on his performance. He had grown so much from the shy boy who once practiced on a paper keyboard, not just in his musical abilities, but in his confidence and sense of self. Eliza stood chatting with Mrs. Rivera and several other teachers from the foundation. In her role as community outreach coordinator, she had become the heart of the organization, the person who could speak to parents and children from underprivileged backgrounds because she had walked in their shoes. "Excuse me," said a voice at her elbow. Eliza turned to see an older woman with silver hair. "You're Miguel's mother, aren't you?" "Yes," Eliza replied with a smile. "Did you enjoy the concert?" "Very much," the woman said. "I teach music at the State University. Your son has remarkable talent. Has he considered applying to our junior program? We offer advanced training for exceptional students his age." Before Eliza could respond, Miguel appeared at her side, having overheard the conversation. "Really? The State University program?" His eyes were wide with excitement. The professor smiled at him. "You would be a wonderful addition. Here's my card. Have your mother contact me if you're interested." As the woman walked away, Miguel looked up at his mother, hope written all over his face. "Can I apply, Mama, please?" "Of course you can," Eliza said, tucking the card into her purse. "We'll talk about it tomorrow. Tonight is for celebrating." James joined them, carrying 3 glasses of sparkling cider. "A toast," he proposed, handing them each a glass. "To Miguel, for a magnificent performance. And to you," Eliza added, "for making all of this possible." James shook his head. "I just provided resources. You two did the real work." He raised his glass higher. to music and to the doors it opens. They clinked their glasses together, the three of them forming a small circle amid the crowded reception. Around them, similar scenes played out. Other young musicians celebrating with their families, teachers congratulating their students, donors seeing firsthand the impact of their contributions. Later that evening, as the reception was winding down, a young girl approached Miguel shyly. She was about 8 years old, clutching a program from the concert. "Would you sign this?" she asked, holding out the program and a pen. "I just started piano lessons at the Foundation Center. Mrs. Rivera is my teacher too." Miguel looked surprised but pleased. He took the program and signed his name carefully. "Do you like your lessons?" he asked. The girl nodded enthusiastically. "But it's hard. My fingers don't always do what I want them to." Miguel laughed. "Mine didn't either when I started. Actually, they still don't sometimes." He leaned closer as if sharing a secret. "Want to know a trick? Draw a keyboard on paper and practice when you can't be at a real piano. That's what I used to do." The girl's eyes widened. "Really, that works?" "It helped me," Miguel said. "Maybe it will help you too." James and Eliza, standing a few feet away, overheard this exchange. They shared a look of understanding. The circle was already beginning to complete itself, with Miguel passing on encouragement to the next young musician. As they left the concert hall that night, they paused on the steps. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling in the darkness. 3 years ago, they had been strangers, a struggling waitress, her music-loving son, and a billionaire who had almost forgotten what truly mattered to him. Now, their lives were intertwined in ways none of them could have predicted. The simple act of a mother lifting her son to a piano had set in motion a chain of events that had already touched hundreds of lives and would touch thousands, more in the years to come. "What are you thinking about?" Eliza asked James, noticing his thoughtful expression. "I was just remembering something my old music teacher told me," he replied. "She said that music doesn't just change how we hear the world, it changes how we see it." He looked at Miguel, who was gazing up at the stars. "I think she was right." Miguel turned to them, his face alight with the pure joy that only comes from finding your purpose early in life. "Can we go get ice cream to celebrate?" he asked, suddenly just a normal 11-year-old boy again. James laughed. "Absolutely. I know just the place." As they walked down the steps together, a passerby might have taken them for a regular family heading home after a special evening. And in all the ways that truly mattered, that's exactly what they were.